In this episode of The Bear Roars, Dan sits down with Pranav Gokhale, quantum software pioneer, startup founder, and a leading force behind Infleqtion's mission to commercialize quantum computing. Pranav's story is one of foresight and focus. From a middle school internship at NIST to launching Super.tech out of the University of Chicago, he's been ahead of the quantum curve for nearly 2 decades. Now at Infleqtion, he's helping build a software stack that could unlock the power of quantum computers, while also delivering real-world applications in sensing, timekeeping, and secure communication. Dan and Pranav explore the layered journey of quantum, from theory to market, from academia to defense, and from early-stage experiments to billion-dollar opportunities. They dive into what's working now, what's coming next, and why quantum may be the defining technology race of the next 50 years. Let's poke the bear to kick off the conversation.
So Pranav, you are both the one that got away, the quantum one that got away, but also on the good news front, the one that didn't get too far away.
That's right.
And why don't we start there? Why don't we explain what I mean by that? University of Chicago guy.
Yeah.
I've since graduated. I've been supporting the new venture challenge there in the Polsky Center. And the Polsky Center got out in front of quantum. And as part of getting out in front of quantum, they set up an accelerator. Okay, so how did you get involved with quantum? And then how did you get involved with the accelerator that was part of University of Chicago? Tell us what that accelerator is and kind of what your involvement in that was.
Well, first off, thanks so much for having me here in beautiful place. It is indeed, I am the one that got away, but still managed to stay in your orbit.
Yes.
Grateful for that. My background is kind of funny in how I got to quantum. So I got into quantum at a very early age at NIST in Gaithersburg, Maryland.
Okay.
And that's the counterpart to the Boulder, Colorado NIST. They had quantum work going on and when I was in middle school and I had the opportunity to intern there. So fast forwarding 10 years, I was all in on quantum because I saw it change from 2005 to 2015. But I didn't feel like it was ready for commercialization.
So when you first began to experience quantum, because in your case it's different. You were young when you were first exposed to quantum, and quantum was more developed than some of us who look back. And I know I was exposed to it first when I was relatively young, but still quantum was in its certainly commercial infancy, if even that.
Yeah.
And I kind of remember my first experiences, but what were your first experiences when you started hearing about quantum? Maybe it didn't really seem that odd to you because you were newer in life and you didn't have a bunch of preconceptions of how the world was supposed to work. But do you remember some of your early reactions when you started hearing about what quantum was all about?
I do. It was this superposition, if you will, of both being totally unfamiliar and in particular, at that time, the piece of quantum that was starting to be experimentally plausible was quantum cryptography, unbreakable communication. And I grew up somewhat near the NSA. So that was always like a cool thing. Wow, there's this huge supercomputer in the background. But what if you had a quantum encryption? And that's what NIST was doing. So that was just bizarre to me that you could have the ability to detect eavesdropping as one of the aspects of quantum cryptography. But at the same time...
And then maybe you just pause for a second there so that the people listening to this fully appreciate that, which I suspect a lot of them already do, but it starts with being able to break today's encryption. So how does a quantum computer, how does it play into breaking encryption in its current form?
Great. So you're right. Quantum is both the disease and the cure in some sense for encryption. On one hand, in the 1990s, Peter Shor, professor at MIT, figured out that you can use a big quantum computer to factor numbers. And maybe that helps you on your 9th grade math exam, but it also helps you if you wanted to break RSA public key encryption. And that's a lot of words, but basically anytime you go on the internet and there's that padlock icon at the top left in your URL browser, that's indicating that your communications are being encrypted with this cipher that is quantum vulnerable. And so that's one of the...
So basically what today's encryption largely uses is a very hard to solve math problem. So hard to solve that the most powerful conventional computers, not just today, but even the most powerful conventional computers in the future, even in the distant future, won't be able to break encryption as we use it today. However,
Yes.
that changes when quantum computers come onto the scene.
Yeah.
So tell us about Shor's algorithm and what he discovered about how to crack the code.
I'll make the tangential comment first that I think one of the funniest things about cryptography as a science is that it's grounded in mathematicians who love rules and laws and axioms. And yet it's actually a vibe science. You could almost say, and certainly as mathematicians would be mad if I said this, that cryptography is like a social science because it has certain vibes of, well, this assumption of security will never be broken. And so indeed, there was such an assumption about security in the 70s, 80s, 90s that it would be really hard to solve this math problem of factoring numbers. And what happens in the late 90s is that it turns out that if you have a quantum computer, then you can factor numbers and you can break encryption. And so that was the seed that got a lot of the defense and intelligence community interested in what are the other implications. Cryptography is ultimately a vibe science, and certain mathematicians would be upset if I said that, but it is the case that cryptographers build their ciphers on the basis that they won't be broken by certain mathematical discoveries. And in fact, such a mathematical discovery was made in the late 90s with Shor's algorithm. And so that is really the moment, the genesis moment, if you will, of quantum being viewed as this, oh shoot moment of this compute technology is going to be game changing. And so that's the disease part. But the other piece that is really mind boggling is the cure part. And this is back to how I got into quantum was there's this aspect of cryptography being a vibe science in some sense that you make certain assumptions and certain beliefs about the world that you pray are true. It turns out that quantum also gives a way to cast aside those assumptions with quantum cryptography. And that's basically this very, very guaranteed, secure way of exchanging keys between person one and person two. And the reason that I thought, going back to me in middle school, that was bizarre was that it threatened to overturn the entire way that cryptography books were being written. That's the way I was learning about this stuff, just some popular science books. And so I got interested in that notion of this technology rewrites assumptions about the world and makes parts of science that used to be based on beliefs and maybe prayer and thought into something that has very rigorous foundations. So that's how I got into quantum from the beginning.
And the other aspect that's important to understand on quantum effects on encryption is each of the nation states store a lot of the secrets of other nation states in computers that they can't break into because of encryption. But the reason they store it, even though they can't break into it, is because there's this notion that someday they will be able to crack the code and see all of this otherwise encrypted information. And the crack the code will be done through quantum computing. So it set off this arms race between China and Russia and US, and now joined by many other countries across the world, and probably even companies who operate as nation states, that if we can crack today's encryption, we've already stored kind of the information that is the secrets of other countries, and we'll be able to crack in those and see what they've been hiding from us. So there's the notion that if US does that before other parts of the world, we'll have a big advantage. If other parts of the world do that before us, we'll have a huge disadvantage. And with that becomes a lot of funding into quantum, a quantum's arm race that is fast and furious today. So you probably didn't know that then when you first stumbled across this, but that's certainly what the realization that came to be, and a lot of what has been the early momentum behind quantum. So you get into encryption, you see this quantum way of protecting information, and it draws your interest.
Exactly. And so this is now 2005. So still very early days for quantum computing. Fast forward 10 years, graduate college, and it's still early days for quantum computing. I wanted to step into that world, but it didn't feel like the time was ready because it was still whiteboards and blackboards and not yet hardcore experiments. And so I decided to go to Silicon Valley. I was interested in tech startups, worked at a couple of tech startups in the Valley, and I loved it there. It was just phenomenal. But what I kept coming back to was
what were the tech startups that you worked at?
It was Quora, the question and answer website. So I was on their machine learning team working on ranking of feeds, and then another startup called Telepath, which was also sort of in the social space. So that was what was hot in 2015, 2016. And I loved it. But I also had this kind of nagging maybe worry and dissatisfaction that what I was doing was not really a 0 to 1 technology. It was more of a 1 to N. And so in 2017, I decided, 2016, I should go back to quantum. And the moment that sealed the deal for me was a paper came out from Google, and a lot of hats off to their team, that showed really promising results with their type of quantum bit or a qubit. So that was the moment where I decided, you know what, now is the time to go to grad school, because that was at the time the only path to get really deep into quantum. That brought me to University of Chicago in 2017. And Chicago was not really a place that was on my radar at all. I'd never spent time there, but my PhD advisor, Fred Chung, had just moved there from Santa Barbara to Chicago. So the people 1 year ahead of me expected to be in sunny Santa Barbara. They ended up in Chicago, cold winters, but at least I knew what I was getting myself into. And then the short story from there is that Fred and I had this wonderful relationship of turning our research into patents and figuring out ways to supercharge quantum computers with software. And now to bring this back to the start of our conversation, in 2020, we decided to spin out a company called Super.tech, which was based on our research. Had the privilege of getting to know Crusoe Ventures and also Coastal Ventures, got offers of investment from both. And we were pretty close to the finish line in terms of saying, yes, let's do Coastal Ventures and also loop in Dan as our quantum buddy who's seen the industry already. And we can dive much deeper into this, but the short expose is that very much just days before we were ready to sign that term sheet from KV, we were introduced to Infleqtion, previously called Quanta, in the context of thinking about, well, initially they were our customer, but we sort of fell in love with our customer, and they brought to us the vision that what if we combined our software with their hardware? And the rest is history. So for the audience, Dan is also a critical investor and a very helpful investor to Cold Quanta. Maybe you can add more about that, but I've stayed in Dan's orbit through that.
Yeah, and what's interesting is the way I first discovered you guys was through the first cohort, right, of the Duality, which is the University of Chicago sponsored and only of its kind, at least at the time, accelerator focused on quantum.
Right.
So we helped fund that as our foundation is the foundation associated with Crusoe Ventures. So we saw the first cohort go through. You stood out as being a really interesting company to back. I had already been working with Cold Quanta. I came in as an investor, a passive investor, but I helped bridge the time between kind of the team that wasn't the founding team, but it was maybe the first management team, and bridging between that and kind of the team that currently is in place now. After I left the involvement in, still an investor, but the involvement in Cold Quanta, that's when I came across you, unbeknownst to me. I had no idea Infleqtion, Cold Quanta at the time, was in contact with you, but just took a flyer, put in a term sheet, and sounds like came pretty close to being an investor at the time. But when Infleqtion stepped in, did an acquisition, even though you were a brand new company, did an acquisition. Now through Infleqtion, I'm an investor.
Exactly.
in you. So it came full circle. University of Chicago, the Duality Accelerator, Infleqtion, and being kind of a investor and getting to know you better along the way. You know, when Silicon Valley started out, Silicon Valley was about hardware. You know, we think of Silicon Valley as software, but it was hardware. It was disk drives, it was PCs, it was hardware first, software second. Then software took over. In the early days of quantum, most of the companies are about hardware as quantum is developing, but the hardware means nothing without software. What's really interesting about what you're doing within Infleqtion and within the industry is you're focused on the software layer and specifically kind of the middle layer of software. So why don't we talk about that a little bit, and we'll come back and talk a lot about quantum in a more general sense, but let's talk about what role does your group play in developing software for quantum? What type of software are you focused on? What are you doing that you think is particularly unique and important in the development of quantum?
Sure. Let me give kind of a three-part answer. So the first is just the motivation.
And actually, let me back up a second. Maybe first tell us what Infleqtion is as the broader context, and then what the software team at Infleqtion is all about.
So Infleqtion is commercializing atom-based quantum technologies. And the crown jewel of what we're building is the quantum computer. That is the technology that is going to be revolutionary with the biggest market size in terms of solving better energy efficiency problems, better machine learning, et cetera. But it's also the technology that takes the longest time to get there. We're at the cusp of this revolution, but no one in the quantum industry is quite there yet. And so what's unique about Infleqtion is that we're taking this phased approach to getting to that crown jewel of quantum computer that goes through atomic clocks and quantum sensors. And so it's kind of funny, like, what does a clock have to do with the quantum computer? And in fact, with atom-based qubit technologies, quantum bits, there's a very straight line between the atomic clock, the RF sensor, and the quantum computer. And the way that we think about it is pretty similar to, and this is obviously a lofty comparison, but to NVIDIA, where initially...
Who's NVIDIA? What company is that?
Tiny company, a couple billion, maybe $1 trillion now.
Billions, trillions, whatever.
Yeah. But they started as doing graphics and video games, compute for video games, the GPUs, graphics processing unit. And then they got this bigger market, at least for a time, of crypto mining. And then the AI opportunities emerged. And one thing I'll reflect on is there's a lot of news, I'd say 6 months ago, about Jensen Huang of NVIDIA saying that quantum won't be useful for 10 years. And there's a lot more context.
I think he said 20 years.
20 years, yeah.
Yes.
And I was speaking with the quantum team at NVIDIA, and one of the things that they remarked to me that they spoke directly with Jensen about is that Jensen actually doesn't believe that GPUs became useful until about 3 years ago. And what he means by that is Jensen never really was corely passionate necessarily about video games, and certainly not about crypto. They were sort of selling it, but reluctantly. And it's really now that we're in this AI phase that Jensen, for the first time ever himself, according to NVIDIA employees at their quantum group, believe that AI has become, or GPU has become useful, which is a funny way of looking at the world. I'm sure his investors thought it was useful at the $1 billion market cap too. But I think that quantum will evolve in a similar way, where there's products that can address markets today, like atomic clocks, that are not the world's biggest market sizes, perhaps, but they show the commercial muscle of deploying a product, exercising warranty, delivering on time, et cetera. And that DNA feeds into everything we're doing to build the quantum computer, which is really the reason we exist and the reason that this becomes useful in the same way that Jensen thinks that GPU became useful recently.
And it was just about a week or two ago that the best clock in the world just got upgraded to be an even better clock. I don't know if you saw that, but
from June, right?
Yes.
And so that this quantum clock continues to get better by orders of magnitude. It's insane. There's never been any progress like it, except possibly for the explosion of bandwidth. I was reading your book recently and enjoyed that too.
For the first time, Dan Caruso pulls back the curtain in his book Bandwidth, a memoir that celebrates the pioneers who invented the internet's early backbones, the renegades who lit the fiber revolution, the antics that caused the biggest market crash of all time, and the new wave of entrepreneurs who led the industry back from its ashes. Though it seemed to happen in the blink of an eye, the Bandwidth adventure was a multi-decade roller coaster ride involving larger-than-life successes and devastating failures. The unbridled ambition of newly minted billionaires and high-profile tycoons created extraordinary value, unprecedented value destruction, and endless opportunities for a brave few. This reflects tech's past, present, and future, and is a story you won't soon forget. It will help you prosper during today's AI tech bubble. The book is available at dan-caruso.com/bandwidthbook and released in early 2025.
There's some parallels there that maybe we can come back to. But that's Infleqtion in a nutshell. We're building a quantum computer, but going about it through this staged phased process that goes through atomic clocks and
I want to come
sensors.
back to the clocks and the sensors a little bit later in the conversation, but let's kind of just put a little bit of a bookmark there, and we'll come back to those, because I think talking about that in more detail and fleshing out what that really means will be very interesting. But let's keep going, and I'll come back to that.
Sure. So I'll circle back to the software piece.
Yes.
And the first thing I'll observe is the reason that we started our company, Super.tech, spun out of our research, was we saw all of the phenomenal progress in hardware, in quantum hardware. But we realized that the most capital efficient way to make that hardware useful was with software. And the shining example for us was GPU, where perhaps some of your viewers know this, but if not, the NVIDIA GPU platform has with it a software platform called CUDA. And NVIDIA did not have the absolute top of the line GPUs until pretty recently. But what they did have was the absolute top of the line software. This was software that made it so that the programmers could experience the full power of GPU in terms of better ways to do math, multiply matrices, shade in dots on a video game, etc., without ever having to understand the device physics of GPU. And so Fred and I realized, my PhD advisor and I realized, that we could do the same for quantum. And that was the genesis of the company and how we started building out this product called SuperStack, which you got to know as you met us in 2021 or so. But maybe if that's part one, I think part two is, to your point, the core innovation is still happening at the hardware layer. And what we realized is that to be a really successful quantum software effort, we couldn't be at the sidelines. A lot of the other quantum software companies, who I respect, I'm friends with a lot of the founders, et cetera, they have this common pattern, which is that they're sort of waiting for the hardware to arrive. And when the hardware comes that has, let's say, 100 logical qubits that are error corrected, they can do great things with it. But until then, it's kind of a wait and see game, which is not that exciting. And so that's kind of the reason we did the acquisition, and maybe it was a merger of sorts, which was that we saw this opportunity to embed very deeply within a quantum company and make the software force multiply the hardware to pull in the timeline. If it was previously going to happen in year 2031, now it'll happen in year 2028, for instance. And that just has a huge impact in terms of pulling forward the progress, making this industry take off faster, et cetera.
Yeah, so let's get specific on your core software. What role does it play? What are you doing with your software? What do you want it to do? And focus first on kind of, the heart and soul of your core software. And then from there, we'll start to build upon that and talk about the software layers that you see getting added to that over time, as it pertains both to the sensing kind of paradigm, as it pertains to the quantum computer. You guys, we are building at Infleqtion, and then maybe quantum computers overall. So we'll start narrow and we'll begin to edge beyond that.
I'll start with the analogy to networking. And today we all have Wi-Fi in our daily lives, or 5G, et cetera, or internet fiber cable, which you know a thing or two about. And software exists in all three of those modalities in terms of how the data gets packed up and gets to your phone and your laptop. And I'll connect this to quantum in just a moment, but I'll give you an example. If I download an image on my phone on 5G, I maybe am getting a 5 megabyte image, but the number of packets that I get is going to be a little bit bigger than 5 megabytes. And there has been, as you know, phenomenal progress in software for the encoding schemes, getting from 26 signals to go on a copper wire to billions of signals at the same time, the multiplexing. And so that's the analogy with which I think someone could think of quantum software. There's some differences, but the core principle is the same, which is how do we do more with less demanding on the hardware? And it's an especially apt analogy because whenever you pick up your phone and you go through Wi-Fi, it's the signals bouncing off the walls. It is getting corrupted many, many times by the time it reaches your phone. And quantum is similar, but even worse. There is noise sources in the entire environment. And it makes it so that by the time you send a qubit or you compute with a qubit, quantum bit, it's going to get tweaked every other nanosecond in a certain way. And you still want to extract the signal out of it. So at the real core kernel, what quantum software does, our platform called Super.tech, is it makes more efficient ways to use the same number of qubits. And just to give you an example of this, to make it very clear, in December, we announced in partnership with NVIDIA the world's first demonstration of a real material science application on these error-protected logical qubits. And sometimes previously in the past, people talked about needing something like 1,000 atoms per protected qubit. And in our work with our software, you only need 5. So that's like a 3 orders of magnitude reduction in the amount of resources that's needed on the hardware side, thanks to software.
Yep. And I'm going to kind of take what you just said. I'm going to raise it up a level or two for people to follow along. So, and this starts with kind of what is quantum to some degree. So quantum is the physics that pertains to the world that is really small and really cold. When atoms, in this case, when atoms kind of lose all their motion, so they could lose all their motion either because they're extraordinarily cold, colder than outer space, or because they're extraordinarily motionless. When they start getting close to those states, they start taking on different properties. And that's when the magic of quantum could be used to create a computer or create sensors. But the challenge is when there's disruption to those states. So disruption to almost being motionless or disruptions to being frigidly cold, the atoms could pop out of the states that they're in, and therefore it's kind of creating noise. It's creating, the information, instead of it being clear, it's garbled. So not unlike static in our world, which I think everyone understands, there's kind of an equivalency to that in the quantum world where you lose the properties such as entanglement, such as superposition, and hence when you do, the potential inability to make sense out of the compute or the communications that you're trying to use quantum for. So what you just described is part of what you're doing with your software, not unlike what TCP/IP does with the internet, is you're taking kind of this information flow, you're helping to kind of remove the noise and be able to make sense of the information with maybe less need for the stability than you otherwise would need. So that's, as I understand it, that's what you're really focused on. And when he talked about the number of logical qubits versus physical qubits, so in this case, different things could act as qubits. So in this case, we're talking about atoms serving as the qubit. That type of reduction from needing 1,000 qubits to create one logical, I think you said creating maybe a logical out of, how many did you say?
5.
Out of 5 means the pace in which usable quantum computers can come into play is a lot earlier. That's a big, big deal to be able to reduce the need for how many physical qubits you need to create kind of a working qubit, a logical qubit. Now, probably for scientists in the room that focus on quantum, I probably botched up everything I just said.
Yeah, that was great.
But for kind of the audience who's trying to get their head around it, maybe that helps a bit.
It does. And to make that link for maybe the business audience a little more, an example of this, just last Tuesday, we announced with JPMorgan Chase the release of a quantum software library that we've been collaborating with them on that makes that 1,000 to 5 reduction happen for a variety of other applications too. And you could wonder, what the heck does JPMorgan Chase have to do with this? A lot of their complex optimization problems could enjoy a quantum speedup that is dramatic. But the problem is that the types of speedups that they would be after might require 1 billion quantum bits or 1 billion qubits. So they love this because this is an opportunity to go from needing 1 billion qubits to maybe only needing a few thousand. And so that's where it's ultimately a pretty easy business decision. It's, do I need X or Y number of qubits? Y is way smaller than X. Let's go with Y. So that's what software does.
Yeah. And actually, let's go off on a tangent and then come back to the software. And let's talk about the JP Morgan example where you use the word optimization. What are they trying to solve with optimization? If you're a financial institution like JP Morgan, you're looking at quantum and wanted to solve a real world problem, what is the real world problem that they envision solving?
I'll give you two examples. So one of them, we put a paper out with them called QCHOP, and it's for solving constrained optimization. So optimization is a big, big bag of things. And a lot of types of optimizations are hard, but one of the hardest type of optimization, which the world's best industry strength solvers, there's something called Gurobi, which is kind of the top shelf, really struggles at, is optimization where you have to respect some hard constraint. So I'll give you an example. If you are devising a portfolio that has certain trading strategies, you want to make sure that you do the tax implications correctly, that you don't have wash sales. You don't sell something, sell an asset, and then buy it back within 30 days. And so that is a very hard constraint that buying an Apple stock selling an Apple stock and then buying it later 29 days versus 31 days, those are drastically different in terms of tax implications, for instance. So when JP Morgan Chase and other firms construct their trading strategies, they have to tell the computer, I want X, Y, and Z, but absolutely never, ever violate A, B, and C. And so that's an example of the broad class of problems. To make one very specific example that they talk about in their paper with us, when they construct ETFs, they have to decide how much of Apple stock, how much of Google stock, et cetera, to put together. And they want to avoid things that have, unless the investor wants, wild correlations. So if you have two stocks that always grow together, then you could have higher volatility than the end user, the customer wants. And so that kind of optimization problem ends up being one that a quantum computer could be relevant for.
Mm-hmm. So I've also, and I've never heard anyone confirm this, so maybe you can confirm it. But I envision that the quant traders, so traders who use heavy duty math and some of the most advanced mathematicians to come up with trading strategies and have made incredible returns over the years. Renaissance Rentech being kind of the most recognizable one, and maybe the most successful one, certainly the most successful one at scale, earning way in excess of returns that you would expect to be able to earn. So they've used conventional math and conventional computers to accomplish that. What I suspect is the case is that when quantum computers become capable, that these type of mathematicians will be able to use quantum approaches, quantum software approaches to creating trading strategies that allow them to make significantly above normal returns at substantially lower risk profiles because of being able to see trades, kind of understand trades that are otherwise invisible for those who don't know how to do quantum math and don't have access to quantum computers that you could process the quantum math through. So I assume that they've already got people working on that in anticipation of, hey, at some point in the not too distant future, we are going to have access to a quantum computer that can solve these math problems. So let's get fully prepared to use those quantum computers, and so that we can hit that running. Have you heard anyone talk about that, or is that just kind of a strange speculation in my mind that they're probably doing that already?
It's absolutely happening. And there is a timescale piece here. As you may know, among all the problems that quantum computers will be good at, optimization is probably the most challenging. And so it is still one that enjoys a very nice speed up from a quantum computer, but it requires the biggest quantum computer, which again is why JP Morgan Chase would care about reducing the resource requirements by a factor of 100. But even then, it is apparent to them that these kinds of the early investments they make capture IP. If IP has a 10, 17-year window, then they get to block off their competitors from doing it. So a lot of the firms that you just mentioned, we have spoken with, and they're starting to dip their toes in. Maybe just to bring this circle back to the Infleqtion story, I'll give the example of Optiver, which is one of the world's best trading funds. They're based in the Netherlands, but have a significant US presence as well. While, to my knowledge, they're not deeply invested yet in quantum computing, they are among the world experts of quantum timing. And so they have data centers in Chicago, in New York City, and I think Newark as well. And for a number of reasons, some are regulatory where they have to have very good timestamps. Some are because they just want to get their trade in before their competitor does. They need to have very high precise atomic clocks. And so finance is actually one of the first adopters of atomic clocks outside of kind of the national security reasons people buy clocks. And that was just one of the nice synergies we saw when we talked to companies like this, is that they might start by being interested in clocks, but then they get drawn to the quantum computer because we're their trusted partner, or vice versa. Both directions happened.
So most people who are listening to this are familiar with the Flash Boys book. The Flash Boys book, written by, I'm going to forget his name, one of the most popular authors. Maybe you guys can look that up really quick. I don't know why I'm forgetting his name. The Flash Boys was about high frequency trading, and what you needed for that was fiber routes that were low latency, meaning information can move from one end to other very quickly. And there was a network built to accomplish this that was driven by these traders that was called spread networks. So the shortest network between the New York Stock Exchange and the Chicago Mercantile Exchange, and those who had access to that network would be able to front run these trades. They were able to basically see trading activity for a milliseconds before it would actually be executed, get trades done in front of it, and make a spread, and just run it over and over and over and over again. Whereas each one of those trades would pay them off in a pretty guaranteed fashion until kind of over a long period of time, people would catch on to that and the window of opportunity would shorten. But in the multiple years it would take to do that, literally, millions and billions of dollars were made by these traders. We bought Spread Networks, which is kind of cool. Michael Lewis.
Yeah.
Michael Lewis, who's done a lot of just great books that kind of find these little clever niches. So you brought up earlier in the conversation, we talked about the neutral atom modality of quantum, that it doesn't just apply to quantum computing, it applies to timekeeping.
Yeah.
You now brought up a timekeeping example, which is if you are using these very advanced clocks, they can keep very precise time at different points. You don't need a fiber network to know exactly what's happening with the timestamp. You see the time much more clearly than others do because of the high-powered computers. That also brings up the notion of maybe one of the first applications of quantum networking. So there's quantum sensing, which includes timekeeping usually. There's quantum computing, and the third category is quantum communication or quantum networking. And then you could put the first and the third together and use kind of a network to distribute time, where you don't need one of these very precise and often very expensive clocks at every location, but one clock can serve maybe multiple locations, and fed through fiber links to different stock exchanges or trading floors that are connected in a given geography. So it may be, to go back to use the internet analogy, TCP/IP, which is a lot of us who think of what is the internet, we think of that coding scheme, which is kind of what you're working on.
Yep.
We think of the fiber networks that carry the internet around. And there's a lot of analogies there. And then when you were talking about how JP Morgan wants to use it, that now goes up to the application layer. So you've got kind of your networking layer, your physical layer, your application layer, and a lot of in-betweens those. You've got the equivalent data centers playing a role in that, computers, quantum computers. So you're almost rebuilding a whole infrastructure around quantum. A quantum Internet of Things, quantum computing infrastructure, quantum communications networks. All that's going to happen in the next 20, 30 years. And all that went with building out the internet is probably going to happen again in building out kind of the quantum infrastructure of the next 100 years.
And maybe if I'm allowed to break the rules a bit, I can ask a question back to you, which is in this direction. Going from Zayo to the quantum industry that you've stepped into to some extent, and were the CEO of Cold Quantum for a bit. Looking back at year 2025 now, it's pretty clear why you would do that, seeing how big the quantum industry has become. But when you first took your steps in quantum, it's not necessarily an obvious thing to go from $10 billion company to small 100-person startup, et cetera. What did you see in quantum that made you want to kind of take this bet?
Well, quantum's been a area of interest for me for 30 years. I discovered quantum a long time ago, and every time something came out to read about quantum, I would find the time to read it. So I've been kind of, hanging out in the fiber and bandwidth industry, just waiting for quantum to, get ready for prime time. So my transition wasn't necessarily from the industry where I ran Zayo and other companies to deciding to go into quantum. It was deciding to no longer be someone who wanted to run businesses. That I viewed that as I was done with kind of that kind of stage of my life, and accomplish what I wanted to accomplish, but wanted more balance in life, not just personal and business, but also the freedom to explore other business interests. I wanted to do it more from the vantage point of an investor, not as an operator. So there was never any intent to run a quantum company, or is there intent going forward to run a quantum company? That was just a bridge, to get to a management team. But there was kind of a jumping toward quantum. I had a dinner at my house here that originated with the founder of Cold Quanta, Dana. Called up, heard I was interested in quantum, said they needed some funding to host a quantum conference. Asked if I would provide some funding. I said, sure, but on one condition: I want to host you guys for dinner at my house, and you bring all your quantum scientist buddies, and let's just have a free-flowing conversation about quantum. And that's when I started to fully realize how important of a role that Boulder and Colorado play in quantum, how fundamental the role was, and that there were real quantum companies that were beginning to emerge. And that drew me into quantum. And then one of the Foundry Group partners called me and said, hey, we're about to do this investment in Cold Quanta. Do you want to put some money in with us? I think they thought I was going to put $100,000 or $200,000. And I'm like, yeah, I'll put it in. I ended up writing a bigger check than that. And, that led to involvement there. But since I've been involved in, 5 quantum investments, and hopefully, knock on wood, soon to be 6. There's one that we're getting pretty close on that hopefully we get to the finish line. And every one of them is doing really well. One's, likely to exit in the very near future at a really nice multiple. And we're excited. It's just, I'm just get frustrated that I'm not going to live for another 30 years because I want to see what quantum world looks like 30 years from now. And I'll probably have to, wonder about that before I actually get to see it happen. But who knows? Maybe I'll get to live to be north of 100 and get to see it 40 years from now.
I hope so. Well, I can just reflect on that in my own experience. There's absolutely drivers of, both for me and all of our employees, reasons to do quantum. I mean, obviously, it's commercially exciting, it's entrepreneurially exciting, but it's also one of the few technologies that really changes the shape of what's possible. And I think it almost sounds too romantic to be true, but every time I go to work, it's like I really don't feel like it's work. I feel like I'm inventing the future. And I think that's very much true. But the other piece that has become more palatable and in front of us in the last 2 or 3 years is the national security aspect that you alluded to too. And Boulder is very much at the forefront of that. But I don't think I realized back in 2018 or so how important quantum and being ahead in quantum would be to the US's stature as a leading technological nation.
Let's go on that tangent. Because we sort of alluded that with quantum computers, encryption, and to me that's like initially that's what drove this notion that there's this quantum race that is essential. But the quantum race that's essential in the near term is certainly not just that. In fact, maybe that's secondary to other aspects of what quantum means in terms of defense tech. And can you talk about how quantum sensing, quantum timekeeping, why are those relevant when it comes to the ability of nations to protect themselves and not get taken advantage of by other rival nations?
Sure. So I'll start by saying one of the nice things for me about the Infleqtion acquisition was I got to go to conferences, and there's always the question you get of when will there be quantum advantage, which means usually people mean when will quantum computers be better than classical computers definitively. And I get to tell the answer that, well, Infleqtion already has quantum advantage through our atomic clocks. And the reason is that atomic clocks are aboard every single GPS satellite. And for the listeners of this podcast, the reason that timekeeping is so important in GPS is based on the simple formula that distance is speed times time. And so if I want to know how far I am from something else, then I take time and I multiply it, in this case, by the speed of light. So the speed of light has 9 digits long. And that means if I want to know where I am within 1 foot, then I need a timekeeping device that is also 9 digits of precision. And the only thing that can do that is atomic clocks. So whenever you open up Google Maps or, God forbid, Apple Maps, and you use GPS, you're actually getting signals that are timekeeping signals sent from clocks aboard these satellites in space. So the reason this has become such an important national security piece is twofold. The first is that it has become very easy and very routine to disrupt these GPS satellites. If there's websites that track, for instance, all over Ukraine, Russia, etc., GPS is always denied almost in certain parts. In Israel, they voluntarily deny their own GPS systems so that missiles can't hit because they don't have GPS. And so that's concerning, and it motivates the US government and allies to think about ways to bring better positioning down to Earth. That could either be moving the atomic clocks from satellites to 5G stations, 6G stations. It could also be just having more direct ways of doing positioning with quantum sensors that have inertial sensing. So the same way when you're in a car and you close your eyes, you sort of still know if you're going forward, backward, left, right. A quantum sensor can do the same thing. So that's one of the pieces of the puzzle.
On the very last thing you said, quantum sensors can do the same thing. So quantum sensors can keep track of themselves, keep track of what direction they're going, how fast they're going that direction, whether they're rotating, whether they're accelerating, whether they're decelerating. So all those aspects of knowing where you are, where you're going, and how you're getting there, the level of precision that a advanced quantum device can keep of itself without needing to synchronize with anything else is kind of where we're headed. Today those have to be pretty big pieces of equipment. They're pretty expensive pieces of equipment, but like all equipment trends, they become smaller over time and they become less expensive over time, and hence you can deploy them in more and more situations. So we think about, well, where would you deploy those if they were smaller and less expensive? Well, maybe every plane should have an advanced atomic clock. Maybe every boat should have one. Maybe every cell tower should have one. Well, what if they get even smaller? What if they even get less expensive? I don't know. Maybe every phone should have one on it, and every phone can keep track of itself, high degree of precision. Every car that wants to be autonomous maybe should have this type of technology on it. So the technology is getting embedded in pretty much all things that need to keep track of themselves in one fashion or another, and or need to do something relative to their environment. So why don't we go there a little bit? Like, what would a quantum device, what might it want to do with the environment around it? So think about quantum sensing or quantum internet of things. When we talk about devices and what they might want to do, what things come to mind?
Sure. I'll do 2 examples that come off the top of my head. So one of them is sensing radio signals. And I'll give the analogy of back in the car that you probably drove in your 2008, you might have still had that knob for the FM tuning. And what you know, of course, is that there's a limit to how much you can tune your FM radio receiver. You can go maybe like 89.9 FM to 105.7 FM or something. And If we take that to settings where we need to receive in multiple frequency bands, the canonical example is a Navy ship. If you look at the front of a Navy ship in the back, it looks like a porcupine. You've got a different antenna for every single different frequency it has to listen to. That is a daunting task because you have to, if you want to listen to a new frequency, you have to install a new receiver, you have to configure it, etc. One of the things that these quantum sensors can do is that they can listen to pretty much every frequency from about a few hundreds of kilohertz to about a terahertz and beyond with a device that's the size of a sugar cube. So back to this national security dimension, one of the things that the US, Australia, UK, etc., are very invested in is using quantum sensors to replace radio frequency receivers with A, much higher tunability, and B, much higher sensitivity. That's one example. The other example I'll give is coming back to this.
Well, let's say, so that would be the branch that's called quantum RF.
Exactly,
So
QRF.
QRF, quantum radio frequency. Talk about it in the context of, we think of 4G, 5G networks. When we think about the future, we just assume they'll be called 6G and 7G. Does quantum radio frequency, QRF, will it play a role in kind of what we think of as 6G or 7G networks?
It will. And in fact, we're having deep conversations with a lot of the players that are planning out 6G, 7G, indeed, if they're called that. And one of the observations is that there's still a lot of frequency bands that could be tapped into that haven't been allocated yet, either not by the FCC or they haven't really figured out the right receiving mechanisms for that. I'll pivot a bit and actually talk about biological applications. So there's something called the terahertz gap, which is basically saying that it's very hard to receive and transmit in the terahertz frequency domain. And QRF is one of the solutions there. It turns out that a lot of important biological signals on cell life, on bioreactors, et cetera, happen at that part of the frequency spectrum.
What does that mean? Like that of?
So imagine a company that is developing new drugs, and they have these massive vats that are basically figuring out what is the most efficient way to make this drug and how does it interact with these cells in a petri dish, basically. In order to do that kind of processing, they're fundamentally limited by how well they can listen in on the cell and how it's doing effectively.
Wow. Really?
Yeah. And so one of the applications of QRF that we're advancing in the commercial area is to have better listening and better monitoring of cell life. And this is a pretty unexpected area of quantum RF. I mean, it started as kind of a DARPA program for help our Navy ships not have such a large footprint be this antenna array. But now we're talking to some of the largest biopharma companies that are thinking about how they do better monitoring of their cell reactors.
Wow.
Yeah.
And that's why when we think of, what's quantum going to do to change the world? It's kind of like in the early 1990s, late 1980s saying, hey, this thing called the internet, what's it going to do to change the world? And there's no way we can envision kind of even Uber, something we take for granted in our everyday life. Like, hey, once we have the internet, we're going to be able to pick up our cell phone, press a couple buttons and a car is going to show up with a driver and you go in there. It's going to take you where you want to go and you don't even have to tell it. And then it's going to charge you. You don't even have to pay them. They'll take care of itself. You'd be like, from this thing called the internet? Are you, how did you come up with that? You would have sounded like quite the, futurist if you would have predicted that in the early 1990s. And I liken that to, this was a great example that it's hard for us to even get our minds around once we really understand both quantum science, which we have a good understanding of today, but my guess is there's a lot more to understand about the science of quantum itself, but the engineering of it and then the application of software on the engineering of the hardware. I mean, what that's going to create in terms of application layer, we're going to discover that as we go along. We're not going to know that in advance.
It's exactly one of the kind of dual opportunities and challenges in this space. The opportunity is everything is an opportunity. The challenge is sometimes when I'm putting together these slide decks, I almost want like a fourth column of target applications saying, I have no idea what this is going to be used for, but I know it'll be valuable in addition to these three that we already have very clear use cases on. And this is one of the examples where 2 years ago, if you had asked me, what does quantum RF have to do with biological targets, I would have told you nothing. And here we are today with pretty concrete conversations to advance this.
Yep. And one thing you did cover, but I want to bring it for emphasis, given that I'm from the communication industry, that it's going to be opening up bands of spectrum that are otherwise difficult to use effectively. All of a sudden, there'll be commercially viable bands of spectrum available, which is going to be needed as wireless traffic continues to grow and grow. So that's a big part of the value prop, having very small receivers that can hear across these broad spectrum is part of the value, and probably getting more out of the spectrum that you're using is part of the value of it as well, I suspect.
Exactly. And on the software side, we have been awarded a contract from the US Navy to basically help them deal with the fact that it's amazing if they have these new technologies, not just quantum, but other technologies that enable wider spectrum listening. But if there's not accompanying software with that to manage that influx of data, then they're in trouble. So on the software side, we're kind of working ahead of the hardware being fully deployed so that they'll be able to use that spectrum when they're able to listen to it.
Well, now you're sneaking ahead of me a little bit because what I was going to come back to in a little bit, after fleshing out some more of these quantum sensing application areas, is, there's the hardware element in that, there's building the devices and equipment, but then there's every software layer you could think of, from, okay, how are you going to actually talk to the equipment and control the equipment, to the applications above it. And really, from your standpoint, by starting with kind of the most basic layer, the connectivity layer, it's probably not the right word, and then building toward the application layer puts you in a very, very interesting position. But before we go there, let's talk about some of these other areas of quantum sensing. So, I've got a couple in mind, but let me see where you go with the next one.
Sure. One of the other things that a quantum sensor can do is sense magnetic fields and electromagnetic fields. 2 examples of where that can be useful. One is back to that navigation. We know that the Earth has a magnetic field that it has a signature. In fact, it even reverses every few years. And so if GPS is denied by our adversaries, then we can fall back to both that inertial navigation system where you sort of know where you are, but there's some accumulating errors, to then fixing it up with magnetic field sensing. So it's kind of a national security domain application of magnetic field sensing. But to give you another example of a serendipitous commercial application, we've been talking to a company that has one of the largest energy companies in the world, has these very large tubes that they use in their generators, and they have to detect when there's a flaw in that tube. And actually the same applies to oil and gas operations that have these long gas pipelines. They have these devices that can go in there, but it's very intrusive if they have to shut off the oil and put the sensor out inside the pipe to figure out if there's a leak or something. So it turns out that if you have a defect in your coils in your generator, or if you have a defect in your gas pipeline, you can detect that if you have a very highly sensitive magnetic field sensor or electromagnetic field sensor. And so that's just another example. This weekend, I was hanging up a painting and I was thinking, wouldn't it be nice if I had a quantum sensor for my stud finder? Maybe that's overkill, but there's just all sorts of unexpected applications too.
Yeah, but building on that, seeing behind a wall, you can also see deep into the earth.
Yeah.
So there was something that flashed on my feed the other day from Scientific America that it seems like they've discovered a huge deposit in somewhere in South America of rare earth minerals, including gold. So lots and lots of copper, which is essentially needed, and other rare minerals. So here on Earth, if you can kind of see where these rare minerals are, the deposits that you need for, cell phones and a lot of modern devices, so you know how deep they are, you know exactly where they are, you can go down and get them. But when they're buried deep in the earth, you don't even know they're down there. And that's true also in space. So on the moon or in meteorites, if you can see where there's these rare minerals, you will know how to go and dig them out and get used to them. So talk about the properties of quantum that allow you to see into kind of the Earth.
Well, first off, I should say, let me know about that gold deposit, because maybe that's our new commercialization strategy.
Yes.
Indeed. So the electromagnetic signature is part of it, but gravitational signatures are another. And maybe this is what you're alluding to.
Yes.
So one thing that's very unique about Infleqtion, kind of cool, is our technology has been and is on the International Space Station. And NASA just announced a couple weeks ago that we have been selected to help them with a project called QGG, which is the Quantum Gravity Gradiometer. And it's basically a satellite that's going to be detecting gravitational fields on Earth. And the applications of this, I'll give you two examples. One is the one that you said, which is if you have a different density material in the Earth, gold has a very different density than the mantle or otherwise, then it'll have a different signature on the surface in terms of, are you being pushed down at 9.8 meters per second squared or 9.81 meters per second squared? But you need a very precise and sensitive sensor to be able to detect that. And not only to detect that, but detect what direction is gravity kind of having an anomaly in. That's the mineral and exploration use case. The reason that NASA wants to do this, maybe that's part of it, but they want to track the melting of polar ice caps, which is another case where ice has a very different density than water, liquid water. And so it's very challenging to weigh the Earth, so to speak, without technology like this. This is a platform that NASA will launch that will be able to basically detect, as it orbits the Earth, how much has the ice changed. And it'll give us some really concrete data for tracking weather patterns and so forth.
Mm-hmm. And on that note, with when we go back to what we started this talking about, defense tech, there's also a lot of defense implications of this too. For example, seeing below the ground and seeing where there are tunnels, where there shouldn't be tunnels, or you don't want tunnels, or where there's nuclear facilities buried deep into a mountain, be able to kind of detect what's really going on there. Or in the case of our service, our military service people, they're able to carry devices on them that use this different type of sensing equipment to see and sense around them, to track themselves, to not have to rely on GPS, to see around corners, to communicate in more advanced ways. So all of these technologies we're describing have both military kind of use cases and very noble use cases like protecting our environment, so making us more healthy. So it's just an unending list of opportunities that come from this. What unique role does... So often when we talk about quantum computers, we talk about modalities, which means different approaches for building a quantum computer, different technology approaches. And as mentioned earlier, what cold quanta, as the name cold implies, now called Infleqtion, what Infleqtion focuses is on the neutral atom or cold atom approach. So that approach, that modality, how unique is that for these category of applications that we call timekeeping, sensing, and communications?
What's really unique about it is the only technology modality that can address all three of them. And one way of looking at Infleqtion historically, cold quanta historically, is that we always knew, and the predecessors always knew, that the sensing and the timekeeping would always, neutral atom would be the way to go. The one that I think is the surprise hit, so to speak, is computing. It is the new kid on the block. And by the way, I'm a fan of all qubit technologies. Our software stack continues to power users from all qubit technologies. And I think there's going to be heterogeneity in terms of qubits. Yes. But within neutral atoms, what we have seen is a dramatic progress between, let's say, year 2018 and today, in going from initial experiments to now being very much a leader in terms of, there's really two axes of what matters. One axis is quantity, the number of qubits. Their neutral atoms are by far the breakout winner. We have a record of 6,100 qubits in partnership. Well, actually, Caltech did it using our hardware. And then quality is the other axis. How close to 100% success rate is each operation you apply. And until recently, neutral atoms were not very good in this department. Probably when you were investing in cold quanta, the quality rate was maybe around 60% or so. And you really need about 99% to start to build a real quantum computer. Today, we have 99.73%, which is the record amongst neutral atoms, but it is not as good as other companies that are doing the trapped ion modality or superconducting modalities. So I think if I zoom out, the miracle, so to speak, is that 1 qubit technology is good for timekeeping, sensing, and computing. And I'll openly say that sometimes it's a blessing, but it's also a curse because we have to figure out with finite resources how to sequence our bets and how to have a lot of focus on what we do. But it is also a blessing that we can do all 3 of these other qubit modalities like superconducting, trapped ion, photonic. They're really only good for that last piece of computing, and they are very good at it. But neutral atom has suddenly caught up and in some cases gone far beyond superconducting and trapped ion too.
Great. Okay, so let's get back to the heart and soul of what you do, which is the software layer. And let's start with that first layer of being, would you call it the control layer, or what would you call that
control
first layer?
middleware, both of them.
Yeah.
Right.
So maybe take us all the way from the interface with the hardware itself and what role you play to working up toward the middle layer. And then how do you, from there, work with the application layer? So maybe walk us through each one of those and, both what you do and think you're going to be doing to how you enable kind of the broad set of computing technology, not just quantum computers, but in some respect, working with the most advanced conventional computers, I think is safe to say. So how are you, what role are you playing there? And then work your way up the software stack for us.
Sure. Let's do a little bit of tour of the stack.
Yes.
So let's start at that hardware to control layer right at the bottom of the stack. I'll give some examples in each one to make it concrete. And I'll give the example of one of our customers of our quantum software platform called SuperStack. The customer I'll give an example is called QScout, which is maybe one tangent is the US does kind of have 2 national quantum computers. They're not explicitly called that, but they are in the sense of the DOE has anointed 2 facilities to be the test beds of quantum computing. One is Sandia National Labs QScout, which is a trapped ion quantum computer. And one is Berkeley Lab in California's advanced quantum test bed that's superconducting. And both use our software as their compiler stack. So if I give you the example of QScout, the key insight that we've had there is that their hardware has some gates, some operations that are very good, and some that are less good. And so what we do on that platform is when a user's program comes in, we try to rewrite that program in such a way that instead of using, let's say, gate A is very good and gate B is very mediocre, instead of having 10% of the operations go to gate A and 90% go to gate B, we find ways to flip that. And so this goes back into this bigger picture of force multiplying hardware with software and having the control stack know when to kind of marshal different operations to the best possible subsets of the hardware. So that's kind of at the very bottom level of the stack. And this is something that they use just to run any circuits that are going to run on the QScout platform. If I go up a half step, we're in this sort of middleware level of the stack. And an example of what I'd give here is not unlike when you run a program on your laptop, you open up Microsoft Excel, et cetera. It does a lot of behind the scenes work to figure out how to get the program to run on the fastest parts of your laptop. So for instance, your laptop has a hard drive, which is very large in space, but very slow in speed. It also has the reverse. You have RAM and L1 cache, L2 cache, which is very small in space relative to the hard drive, but it's very fast. And so what our middleware stack does is basically takes the input program and figures out a way to move the data that needs to be addressed very frequently next to each other and move the data that is less important to the edges of your qubit array, where it's okay if it's far away and slow and low quality because we don't have to bring it in that often. And then I'll do 2 last layers of the stack. If I go up from that middleware to the error correction level of the stack, I'll just go back to this example that I gave with the library that we released with JPMorgan Chase. But I'll bring back this analogy of when you download an image on 5G, it's a 5 megabyte image, you're actually getting more than 5 megabytes of packets. And that's the error correction that's built into 5G, into Wi-Fi, et cetera. And so at this level of the stack, we're basically building the software that makes it possible to have very efficient ratios between the number of packets that we get in and the number of qubits that we produce out of that. And then the very last level of the stack is the actual algorithm. And this is the level of the stack where our approach is very much co-design in collaboration with the end users. I'll give the example of CSL Behring is one of the world's largest biopharma companies. And we recently partnered with them and put out a paper showing how a problem called protein filtration can be mapped very well to a quantum computer. And so this is the kind of prototypical example where I don't know a thing about protein filtration. They don't know a thing about quantum computers. But the MO is we get into a room with them for, in this case, we had a workshop with them and then just kept communicating back and forth. We actually created a really interesting new quantum algorithm that maps protein filtration to a quantum computer.
So what does protein filtration mean?
Well, I mean it when I say that I really don't understand it. But okay, I'll tell you the little of what I know, which is that when they are building pipelines for producing drugs, they have to have a filter, not unlike your water filter, to get some of the things that they don't want to go into the capsule filtered away. But they need to have very efficient filters that don't get caught and stuff. So that's my rough understanding of it.
Gotcha.
Yeah. And then maybe the last comment I'll make is that these layers of the stack, the reason that we were very different than other quantum software companies is there are quantum software companies that are working on one layer of the stack, another layer of the stack, et cetera. But the problem is when one designs the system in that level of modularity, one day that is going to be the right answer, the same way your computer today has very well layered stack abstractions. But what we realized is that quantum computing is more like what classical computing was in the 1970s, when there were these leaky abstractions where the application, the middleware, the control, they're inherently intertwined. And so we decided to take the somewhat ambitious approach of architecting an entire top-down stack. It's a lot harder, but it means that there's force multiplication at each step of the stack instead of having these kind of artificial boundaries. And that's going to change one day, but today it's really important to have that level of cohesion across the stack.
And when you say it'll change one day, that one day is probably 10 plus years from now, not 2 plus years from now. The need to look at that holistically probably has to continue until quantum computers become much more commonplace, I would imagine.
Yeah, exactly. One example I think of in the classical computing space is did you ever have or know the computer game Doom?
I know the game, but I was never a computer gamer.
Same here, but what I know about it is it was like a breakthrough in graphics, and the programmer who wrote Doom was actually programming all the way down to the chip level, which is totally different from today. Like someone who's building a social media app doesn't ever think about the device physics of the transistor. But until pretty recently, just a couple decades ago, that was normal practice for programmers to go deep into the assembly, et cetera. And again, one day that's going to change. It's not going to always be the case that the cutting edge applications require knowledge of the underlying device physics. But for quantum today, that's very much the case.
Yep. And Infleqtion just recently completed a significant funding round. What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, sure. Well, let me ask you, when is this episode going to be released?
Whenever you tell us it can be released.
Well, I'm happy to say what we can right now. We did complete a Series C transaction, and we're thrilled about that. It came in with a very solid base of investors, I believe yourself included. So
yes.
Always appreciate your participation. It was led by Glynn Capital, which is a Silicon Valley firm, and importantly has a number of other investors that are world-renowned in terms of leading companies like Coinbase, Cohere, Scale AI, et cetera. So they've seen technology go from the ChatGPT moment to holy smokes market caps. So I think we've evolved to a really exciting set of investors, and it gives us a lot of runway. We did about $30 million of revenue last year, and that is, as you know, pretty large in the quantum space. To give a comp, Rigetti, one of the public companies out there, maybe $2 billion market cap, did about 10 million. And this revenue is poised to grow pretty strongly. So yeah, we're pretty excited about the Series C, and I think it's due to be announced around end of this month, May.
Gotcha. Well, we definitely won't publish it before the end of the month, so it'd be safe in that you didn't disclose any more than you need to, but it'll be at least a couple of weeks.
Sure. Well, in that case, maybe one thing I can add is I'm really excited about some of the biggest check writers in this round include Morgan Stanley, a tiny company you might have heard of, and also Section 32, which is sort of a spin out of Google Ventures, if you will. Done a lot of great deals, and they're both thrilled about this round, and hopefully we'll continue to participate in our upcoming investment rounds too.
Yeah, I mean, Section 32 is top shelf investor. We've been a LP of them through past relationships, so I know them well. It's Bill Maris, right?
Bill Maris,
who was, I think, the original Google Ventures.
Yes, yeah.
CEO, managing director. So that's a really big deal to get Section 32 as an investor at this point in the company. And yeah, no, I'm excited. You guys have a nice war chest to fund this next round. Be able to, because you're doing a lot of different things, both on the software layer and the various different hardware layers. So the need to fund multiple different related applications in parallel is important at this point. And who knows what the round after this will look like? But there's certainly the public comps right now are. What's IonQ, like $7 billion market cap?
Yeah.
And then there was just the announcement that PsiQuanta. By the way, what's going on with PsiQuanta? What, they seem to get a lot of attention. I was in Chicago, so someone influenced by that, but they just announced a funding round, or soon to be rumored funding round, that sounds like NVIDIA is planning on participating in. That is a $5 billion type valuation.
Yeah.
What's your views about PsiQuanta?
They're a really interesting company, and I would almost describe them, and I think I mean this in a positive way, as the antonym of Infleqtion, where they're very, very narrowly focused. And in many cases, that's a very good thing. They're focused on a photonic-based qubit technology, very different than the neutral atom, trapped ion, superconducting, et cetera. And they're only focused on quantum computing. And what's strange about their approach is that they haven't really demonstrated a qubit yet. But to their credit, if they succeed in de-risking a few really key technical barriers, such as photon loss in some systems, then they will have a really compelling path to a large-scale quantum computer. I think my critique of it is, well, I think their approach is sort of a give us money, give us 10 years, don't talk to us in the meantime, and then come back and we'll have a quantum computer for you. That's awesome. And my view and why I was drawn to Infleqtion part was that I like to see the phased commercialization. I like to see the feedback loop from the market at every stage along the way. They're taking a very bold bet, and I have only respect for that, but that bold bet will take many years to pay off. It's clearly been successful in the fundraising markets, though.
Yep.
So hats off to them.
And this is even in the quantum computing realm. This isn't one modality takes all. Just like today, when you think of the computing and communication networks that have resulted out of the earliest idea of a computer, there's many, many different technologies that make up a computer, and many different types of computers, and many different ways of connecting them together so that they can communicate with one another and with people. And the same thing's going to happen with quantum. There's going to be a lot of modalities that play significant roles in a different part of a computer, different part of a computing environment, and the broader communication network and devices that leverage quantum. So there are going to be many modalities that win, and there's going to be multiple companies within each modality that play a significant role. But over time, there will be aspects of winner take all in kind of certain aspects of quantum. So it could both be true that there will be a winner take all dynamic like there is in most technologies. Maybe duopolies develop in some cases, Windows and Apple. But when you then take a step back and say, yeah, but if you're talking about the broadness of quantum, there's lots and lots of categories. There's roles for the Ciscos of the world. There's roles for the data center builders of the GPUs of really all aspects of what's going to make this new type of world around quantum kind of come to life. There are going to be a lot of different companies that play significant roles and a lot of technologies that are essential. So let's look.
I was going to say, I think about this in that classical umbrella too, where today we have flash memory, we have magnetic grooves and hard drives, still have Blu-ray, DVD, etc. So there will be a coexisting of multiple qubit technologies too, I think. As long as we're not the punch card, which is another way of storing bits, then I'm happy.
Yeah. So let's start looking forward on the software side and let our minds wander a bit. So put on your futuristic hat and tell us what thoughts come to mind when you're just wandering around kind of what quantum might lead to 10, 15, 20 years from now. Maybe thinking about from the application layer, which really means software. So what you're doing with software to create applications, what interesting things come to mind? What use cases do you think quantum plays a big role in? And I would maybe lead the witness a little bit and maybe think in terms of space tech, think in terms of robotics, think in terms of autonomous vehicles. How do you think quantum plays a role in our future world?
Sure. So I'll give you an answer that's actually quite near term, but will have long-term development too, which is something we introduced called contextual machine learning. And this is the intersection of quantum and AI that I'm most excited about. There's a lot of overlap in some ways between quantum and AI. They have the same underlying math, linear algebra, et cetera. But there's also a lot of disjointness. There's been attempts to take AI and speed it up with quantum that have not succeeded. But we were very happy and somewhat serendipitously found a way to extend context windows with quantum. And for the listeners, you may know that ChatGPT, Google Gemini, et cetera, the fundamental bottleneck for the transformer technology that powers modern AI is how much data can they take at once, which is the context window. So you can give ChatGPT 30 pages of text, won't complain. But if you start to pass about 100,000 tokens, so maybe 100 pages, 200 pages, it physically can't go further. It's a very hard limit. And right now the record is Google Gemini can do about 1 million tokens of context, but that's not good enough.
And 1 million tokens of context is about how many pages?
One token is about half of a word. So think of 1 million tokens of context as 500,000 pages. Maybe that's about, for the absolute record of Google Gemini, you can take a book, you can take bandwidth and it'll handle it, but it can't take 2 bandwidths per se. So that's fine for maybe applications that you and I would interact with in our daily lives. But in those domains like space tech, robotics, et cetera, that means that transformers, which is ChatGPT, OpenAI's model, Google Gemini, et cetera, they will never, on their current scaling trajectory, be relevant for processing the data streams that a satellite gets, or that a robot gets, or a self-driving car is getting 60 frames per second of images. Each image is almost 1 million tokens on its own, perhaps. So that's a real problem. And one of the things that we found is that quantum computing changes the fundamental scaling law for context window. And that's obviously a very exciting thing because it's like probably the world's biggest problem in AI today. And it's serendipitous that quantum happens to help there. So in March, just 2 months ago, we announced at NVIDIA's GTC conference, where we were invited, the existence of this contextual ML approach. We unveiled it and announced contracts from both the US Army and the US Navy to apply this technology to their sensor data streams. And the craziest thing of all is that this was originally a quantum computing algorithm. But as we developed it, we found a way to profitably simulate it on GPU. And so this is another instance of commercializing quantum in a somewhat unexpected way by bringing it forward to GPU. And arguably that's a dangerous path because we push out the need for the quantum computer in some sense a little bit further. But that's, to your original question, what I'm most excited about is this intersection of where can quantum methods and quantum thinking in the algorithmic level of the stack be relevant on GPUs. And so the defining example for me is context window expansion. Can we take sensor data streams? Can we take weather streams? Can we take financial transactions that have billions of points and put them out into modern machine learning approaches where ChatGPT doesn't work?
What do you think? Living things, whether it's us as humans, or I'm looking at a tree blowing in the wind out there. We're big sensors and we're big computers, so we sense the environment through a lot of different intakes. We see, we smell, we touch, and then we process, and then we use that to act in real time. What do you think? What role do you think quantum plays in how living things function? Do you think it's just that's essential that we, because you just mentioned even the ability to take a book the size of bandwidth and run through AI is kind of at the limits of what you can do with conventional computers. And I don't know if you meant that in the context of, just with today's technology, or does that limit, continue to be kind of a ceiling for what you can get away with conventional approaches to compute. And at some point that's got to be further enabled by quantum in a more absolute sense. But what does that tell you about how living things use quantum to function?
I think you're knocking on the door of a really important first principles observation, which is that we haven't cracked the nut yet on AI because you've received billions of tokens of context in your life, and yet you probably remember your best friend's name from elementary school, and that was billions of tokens of context ago.
That's only because I see him far too frequently. It's Marty, by the way.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay. But point being that humans don't really have this issue of context window that ChatGPT has. I read bandwidth and I could read it again, and I would love to read it again, and that won't be a problem for me. But it is a problem for ChatGPT. Mm-hmm. So whether or not, I guess one direction you could think of is, are there quantum effects in our brains? And I would describe that as a controversial question. Most scientists think the answer is no. But on the flip side, why do
most scientists think the answer is no?
So it comes back to this notion of quantum computers have to be very cold and isolated, and the brain doesn't have this isolation of, there's no laser cooling in the brain, there's no super cooling, or Mabel Quantum doesn't have a fridge in the brain yet. They probably will at some point. But to the spirit of your question, then there's also evidence that things like photosynthesis happen because of quantum mechanics. So I would say there's perhaps a little bit of dogma in science against believing that quantum is part of the brain. I don't really have a stance on it, but I do have the observation that with existing technology, we haven't cracked the nut on AI despite the progress. And quantum technology is one way to potentially crack the nut. There's also quantum inspired, which is taking the insights of quantum and still bring them to GPU that might end up cracking the nut in the same way that we've cracked the nut because we remember our elementary
school friends. The reason I think that scientists are wrong on the majority of them on that is, you always hear of in particular identical twins who are physically separated from one another, sensing something happen to their twin. It's not always identical twins, but it's far more frequent with identical twins. And the story is always similar. It's that one sense that something happened to the other. They sensed it in an emotion. Maybe it was fear, maybe it was concern, but they had no idea what happened. Okay, so they felt something that was heavily correlated to what really happened, but then they need to pick up a phone or send a text to each other to say, did something happen? Yes, I just had a baby. Oh, yeah, or something happened to a loved one. And you can't explain that other than there's only two explanations. One, it's not true. People just make that up or think it happened and it's just strange coincidence. Or two, that's entanglement at work.
Yeah.
So if it's entanglement at work, a quantum process is happening within living things, even though we're not, colder than outer space and we're not motionless. So the quantum effect has to be in the body somewhere, the ability to, use entangled particles, entangled atoms or whatever, is entangled between kind of humans who were once very connected to one another and then separate over time. So I think unless someone wants to make the case that that's just strange coincidence that repeats itself over and over again, which I don't think could possibly be the case, it's got to be quantum. What else could it be? So, I don't think you can conclude that our body doesn't know how to harness quantum in ways that we just haven't figured out as the physics behind it.
At the very least, I experienced plenty of decoherence in my brain at the end of a long day.
And certainly at the end of a long podcast, there's a lot of
full
decoherence.
Full coherence here.
All right. But hey, I appreciate you being a guest. I look forward. Matt was a guest, the CEO. I'm having dinner with him tonight.
Awesome, Tom.
Which would be fun. And
he's been fantastic.
Yeah, I'm really pleased with what he's done since taking over the helm there. He's been involved with it for a long time as an investor and now as the CEO. And I'm really excited about the path that Infleqtion is on. As you said, I put additional money to work in the latest round, even though we're pretty heavily invested already. And really think the company's on a great track and love following the journey along and pitching in a little bit here and there when I can.
Well, thanks so much for having me on and appreciate everything you do for the entire quantum ecosystem. And always a pleasure to be here in Boulder.
All right, good deal. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of The Bear Roars. If you enjoyed the episode, please like and subscribe on your listening platform. This podcast was produced by Loud Bear Productions and edited by Courtney Caruso with support from Kendall Weinberg, Emily Reed, and Gibson Siegert.